This will be a survey of the fourth book of the Bible called Numbers. This may be one of the scariest books in the Bible. Not by what's written, but by the outcome of what has been written. In that, Numbers reveals the miraculous power of God to keep accurate records on people. Okay, so you have Genesis, man starts in paradise, sins, dies, ends in a coffin in Egypt. Exodus is an exit out of that through the redemption of the Passover lamb. Leviticus reveals the sanctification of man for earthly living, aiding his walk with a holy God. Numbers, the next step, reveals the service of a child of God as a soldier of God. Okay, and Numbers chapter 1, verse 1, "And the Lord spake unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tabernacle of the congregation, on the first day of the second month, in the second year after they were come out of the land of Egypt, saying," and then it says, "Take ye the sum of all the congregation of the children of Israel after their families by the house of their fathers, with the number of their names, every male by their polls, from 20 years old and upward, and all that are able to go to war in Israel. Thou and Aaron shall number them by their armies." So we could see that the Lord establishing a soldiers for him under the Old Testament covenant. Here in the New Testament, Paul writes about this to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2, verse 3, "Endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ." Now, a few years back, I was watching the game show called Jeopardy! And it got to the final Jeopardy! And I don't know what the category was, but it was something to do with the Bible. I think it might have been Old Testament or maybe the Bible. And these three worldly, wise, smart people had to deal or, lay a bet on if they were going to know the question to the answer. And the answer was the fourth book of the Old Testament. And so the question that, how that game show works is, what would be Numbers? Not one of those three was able to get the question or the answer. And that is sad, very, very sad. Because Numbers reveals that God has a miraculous power to keep accurate records of people. Jesus said in Matthew 12, 36 and 37 that we're going to give an account of every idle word. In Romans 2:16, Paul reveals that every secret of man is going to be revealed. In Daniel 7, verse 10, books of records are mentioned that will occur at the white throne judgment, as will Revelation 20, verse 12. In the Bible, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are the public records for the kings of Judah. So God definitely keeps records on each and every one of us, and that ought to be enough to cause a person to consider. In the book of Numbers records the rejection of Israel to go into the land of Canaan. It also records the punishment and death of Miriam, the sister of Moses, and the death of Aaron. So a simple outline for Numbers, if we look at it as a survey where we step back and look at the whole picture, in chapters 1 through 4 will be the soldiers of Israel. Okay, where in the Bible, 20 years would be the age of what is called adulthood. Okay, in our culture, some might say 18. Okay, and others for the Bible might be at conception, so would make it 19. But in America, the common law would establish it at 21. There's a common phrase that used to be said, free white in 21. Okay, whether you like the phrase or not, it doesn't matter. I'm just citing what the phrase was. And so in the Bible, we clearly see we have 20 years for a man to be a soldier in an army. Okay, so that's in chapter 1. Now, under the Old Testament covenant, they could use carnal weapons, physical weaponry, because they were dealing with the kingdom of heaven, where in the New Testament, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but are mighty God to the pulling down of the strongholds. You find that in 2 Corinthians 10, verse 3 and following. And so at the age in chapter 4, verse 3, it seems to give a certain age for a spiritual service would be at 30 years of age. Numbers 4, verse 3. From 30 years old and upward, even unto 50 years old, all that enter into the host to do the work of the tabernacle of the congregation. So they only had to serve there for 20 years. It's not a hard, fast rule, but Joseph began to be the second in charge around 30 years of age. And David became king at 30 years of age. And the Lord Jesus began his ministry just about 30 years of age. I began pastoring for the very first time about 2 months before my 30th birthday. There's something very unique about that age. I guess you're young enough to be strong and you've been hoodwinked enough that you got some wisdom. But Numbers 1 through 4 reveals the soldiers of Israel. Numbers 5 through 7 reveals the discipline of the soldier. Where in chapter 5 there's an event there called the spirit of jealousy. Okay, it's dealing with a family, husband and wife relationship. In number 6, you have the idea of the Nazirite vow, which is a vow for certain selective days. That would be like the elite soldiers, like the Marines or the Navy SEALs in Numbers chapter 6. Chapter 7, you have some detailed records of these soldiers. Chapter 8, you have the purification of these soldiers. 9, you have the Passover mentioned. And in chapter 10, you have a call to battle. Okay, where they have a call to battle for this army. And in chapter 11 deals with the diet, the special diet of the soldier. Okay, where for the Israel they had a certain diet, they were not to eat scavengers. Okay, which, everybody in a way is actually a type of a vegetarian or fruitarian. It's just that how are you going to eat those fruits and vegetables? Okay, if you eat it firsthand, okay, that's what people would call a vegetarian. But if you eat it through a cattle, beef, what you're doing is you're eating it secondhand because the cattle ate the grass or the corn, a vegetable, okay, a seed. The same is true for, chickens or something like that. Okay, now when you eat a hog, you're eating it as a scavenger. Maybe the hogs are raised in corn, okay, or other grains, okay, but a hog in the wild is an absolute scavenger. And a scavenger will be eating off the carcasses of other animals. And for Israel, in Numbers chapter 11, the Lord had a special, unique diet for them, and he did not desire for them to eat scavengers. I would say we could look at that as practical good health principles, but not a hard, fast rule. I personally stay away from scavengers and do limit my meat intake. But you're dealing with the discipline of a soldier, okay? And then in chapters 12 through 25, these are some of the battles of soldiers. The first thing right off the bat in chapter 12 would be the inner fighting, the fighting amongst their own troops. Yes, that does take place. And in this case, it would involve Miriam. Okay, and then in chapter 13, it reveals what happens when some people cause discouragement within the ranks, and it develops a bad morale. It's when the 10 spies came back and gave an evil report where they focused on the obstacles, but Caleb and Joshua focused on the opportunity. In chapter 16, you have someone questioning the authority there, Moses. And in chapter 17, God confirms who the real authority is. In Numbers 19, it reveals the purification of a nation. This is often that's overlooked by people when a nation does go to war. And the true just wars are defensive wars. But when that does happen, the most vital thing is for the nation itself to be purified, to pray, to get right with God. And in Numbers 19 reveals the purification of Israel through the ashes of a red heifer. Okay, and that's some prophetic ideas. In Numbers 20, you have Moses, where his anger and reaction forfeited his right to enter the land of Canaan. Sad event, but it occurs. You see, one is not responsible for the actions of others, but we are responsible for our reaction to their unjust actions. In Numbers 21, you have a wonderful thing about the rescue of the bitings of the serpents, fiery serpents, by the serpent of brass, where people were healed by looking to that, portraying Calvary. In Numbers 22 to 25, you have a man who misleads the soldiers, of Israel, and causes great harm, many deaths in Israel because of this man's deceptions. In Numbers 26 to 36, the rest of this book that keeps accurate records. In 25 to 29, you have some Jewish feast that Israel, these are orders that soldiers are to take care of, these certain feasts. In chapter 30, they have a vow that they are to make. This idea was brought into the American culture where a public servant takes a vow. The vow is to uphold the Constitution of the United States and or the individual state. And when a person takes a vow like that, it's a very serious thing. And God looks at that vow as that is an agreement between that party and God himself. Numbers 30 verse 2, if a man vow a vow unto the Lord, or swear an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceedeth out of his mouth. A public servant is an honorable position when a man stays within his constitutional oath. But when a man steps outside of that, he becomes a public menace. And God himself will require that of that party. Numbers chapter 31 reveals the enemies of the soldiers. And then Numbers chapter 35 goes into some details, the difference between murder and killing, say an accidental death, or killing in a defensive war, or things like that. So the book of Numbers, a survey of Numbers, deals with the work, the service of the soldiers under the Old Testament, the soldiers of Israel. Spiritually, devotionally speaking, for the New Testament, the soldiers of Christ, who will use not carnal weapons to fulfill the missions of God, but will use the spiritual weapons that are available to each and every one of us.